A holy war reshaped our world for 1,000 years. The Crusades were far more than a series of ancient battles. They were a powerful fusion of deep faith, raw ambition, and brutal warfare whose echoes we still hear today. By the end of this journey, you will possess a clear understanding of how these medieval events directly influence modern global tensions and cultural divides. We will uncover why thousands left everything behind, separate the enduring myths from the shocking realities, and follow the long chain of consequences that leads right to our doorstep. What do you believe is the most enduring legacy of a conflict fought in the name of God? The 11th century was a world woven from faith and feudal obligation. In Europe, life was anchored by the church, an institution so powerful it shaped laws, collected taxes, and guided the conscience of kings. Society was a pyramid with popes and emperors at the peak, knights and nobles in the middle, and a vast population of peasants forming the foundation. For these common people, existence was a cycle of harvest and hardship, their lives tied to the land of their local lord, yet a different kind of power thrived to the east. The Byzantine Empire, with its magnificent capital of Constantinople, was the gleaming heir to Rome, a center of immense wealth and sophisticated culture that practiced a distinct form of Christianity. Further south, the Islamic world was in a golden age. Caliphates from Baghdad to Cordoba were hubs of learning, preserving ancient Greek texts, making breakthroughs in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, and building cities that dwarfed most in Europe in both size and splendor. Despite these differences, a profound spiritual yearning connected these disparate worlds. For Christians, a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the city of Christ's Passion, was the ultimate act of devotion. This journey was perilous, but thousands undertook it, traveling across continents to walk in the footsteps of the divine. It was this deep, universal desire for salvation and spiritual merit that would soon be channeled into a movement of unprecedented scale. When the call to arms finally came, it did not land on deaf ears. It fell upon a continent already primed for a great undertaking, where a knight's desire for honor, a merchant's hope for profit, and a peasant's dream of heavenly reward could all be fused into a single, world-altering purpose. Into this simmering world, Pope Urban II threw a torch. In the autumn of 1095, before a vast assembly of clergy and nobility in the French town of Clermont, he delivered a speech of breathtaking ambition. His call was direct. Western Christians must march east, he declared, to aid their Byzantine brethren and to wrest the holy city of Jerusalem from the control of the Seljuk Turks. But this was no ordinary plea for soldiers. Urban masterfully wove together threads of spiritual urgency and earthly desire into a single, compelling cause. He presented this armed expedition not as a war of conquest, but as an act of supreme piety, a pilgrimage with a sword. To those who would take up this burden, he offered an unparalleled spiritual reward, the complete remission of their sins. In that era, the fear of divine judgment and the hope for salvation were powerful, tangible forces. The promise of a clean slate, of a guaranteed place in heaven, was an offer many felt they could not refuse. Yet the Pope was also a practical leader. He spoke to the feudal lords and landless knights of Europe, reminding them of the riches and estates to be won in the fabled East. He appealed directly to their culture of honor and their need for glory. According to chroniclers who were present, like Fulcher of Chartres, the crowd was electrified. A thunderous cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, erupted from the multitude, a sound that would soon ripple across the continent. This single address in Clermont was a masterstroke. It channeled the restless energy of a warrior class, the profound faith of the masses, and the political needs of the church into one surging river of human movement. But while the call was universal, the reasons for answering it were as varied as the people who heard it. What inner forces would drive a person to leave everything behind and march into the unknown? The promise of salvation was a light powerful enough to guide men through hell. For a knight burdened by the violence of his profession, the crusade offered a path to redemption. For a peasant whose life was one of toil and want, it was a chance to achieve a spiritual status that their earthly station could never provide. This was the magnetic pull of the indulgence, a formal grant from the church that wiped the slate clean. It was not a mere piece of paper, but a profound spiritual transaction, a guarantee that the immense suffering of the journey would not be in vain. The Crusaders' journey was framed as the ultimate pilgrimage, an armed procession to reclaim the very ground where Christ had walked. Sermons painted a vivid picture of a holy land defiled and Christian brothers suffering under foreign rule, framing violence not as a sin, but as a sacred duty. This conviction allowed a mother to watch her son march away, or a man to sell his only plot of land, all for a reward they would only collect in the next life. Can we truly grasp a world where the celestial mattered more than the material, where heaven felt more real than the next harvest? Their actions tell us that for them it did. Yet this pure spiritual fire was rarely found alone. It was a flame that burned alongside other, more earthly fuels. The spiritual reward was a powerful promise, but it was not the only one echoing in the minds of those who took the cross. For a vast number of participants, the call to crusade was also a call to a better, more prosperous life on earth. In the feudal societies of Europe, the future was often bleak for younger sons of the nobility. The rigid law of primogeniture meant the family's land and titles passed entirely to the eldest brother, leaving his younger siblings with little more than a sword, a horse, and a desperate need to make their own fortune. For these landless knights, the fabled East shimmered with possibility, a vast frontier where a man could win estates and a title through his own courage and skill. Opportunities that were simply unavailable in the crowded and settled lands back home. This dream of territorial gain was powerfully reinforced by tales of the East's immense wealth. Returning pilgrims and merchants spoke of cities gleaming with gold, of fertile lands yielding abundant harvests, and of trade goods beyond imagination. The crusade was not just a path to salvation, it was a gateway to a land of opportunity. This economic ambition extended far beyond the knightly class. The shrewd merchants of the rising Italian city-states, like Venice and Genoa, saw in these holy wars a tremendous commercial opening. They provided the ships, the supplies, and the naval support for the crusading armies. In return, they secured not just payment, but something far more valuable: exclusive trading rights and fortified ports along the crucial sea lanes of the Mediterranean. For them, the crusade was a strategic investment, a way to bypass old rivals and establish a powerful economic empire that would last for centuries. The journey to Jerusalem, therefore, was filled with a complex mix of motives. A single ship might carry a penniless knight praying for a fiefdom, a merchant calculating his profit margins, and a pious pilgrim seeking only grace. Their goals were intertwined, the spiritual and the material fueling the same massive enterprise. But this grand movement was also shaped by forces even more powerful than faith or fortune, the intricate political chess game being played by kings and emperors. Beyond the call to individual salvation and fortune lay a grander design, a vision of a unified Christian world led from Rome. For Pope Urban II, the crusade was a masterstroke of statecraft. Western Europe was a patchwork of feuding lords and rebellious territories, its warrior nobility constantly fighting amongst themselves. By declaring a holy war against a distant enemy, the Pope redirected that destructive energy outward. He effectively turned the swords of Christendom away from each other and toward a common foe, promising not only spiritual rewards but also a divine purpose that could forge a new, papal-led unity across the continent. This was a strategic solution to the internal violence that plagued his spiritual domain. At the same time, the plea for help from the Byzantine emperor presented a tantalizing political opportunity. The Eastern and Western churches had formally split just 41 years earlier in an event known as the Great Schism. By sending a massive army to the aid of Constantinople, Pope Urban hoped to mend that rift, positioning himself as the savior of the Eastern Empire and potentially bringing all of Christendom back under the authority of the papacy. It was a breathtaking gamble, an attempt to solve multiple political and religious crises with one single, monumental undertaking. Yet these high-level strategies, conceived in palaces and papal courts, were about to collide with the brutal, unforgiving reality of the long march to Jerusalem. While the lords and kings were still assembling their armies and raising funds, a firestorm of popular enthusiasm was already sweeping across the countryside. It was ignited not by a pope but by a charismatic and ascetic preacher known as Peter the Hermit. Riding a donkey and dressed in simple robes, he traveled from town to town, his passionate sermons whipping crowds into a fever pitch. He spoke of the desecration of holy sites and the suffering of Eastern Christians, and his message resonated deeply with the common people. What began as a spiritual awakening quickly escalated into a mass movement, a chaotic and desperate exodus known to history as the People's Crusade. This was not an army in any formal sense. It was a vast, disorganized multitude of peasants, poor knights, women, children, and elderly pilgrims, all driven by a raw, untempered faith. They believed so fervently in their divine mission that they saw no need for careful planning or ample supplies. Many sold their meager possessions to buy a crude weapon or a sack of flour, and with a fierce, almost reckless hope, they simply started walking east, following the sun toward Jerusalem. Their journey was a testament to the power of belief, but it was also a collision with a brutal and unforgiving world. The long road to Constantinople became a gauntlet of suffering. They had left in the late spring, far too late to plant crops for the journey, and their food supplies vanished within weeks. They resorted to pillaging the countryside of Hungary and the Balkans, lands ruled by fellow Christians who were not prepared to feed tens of thousands of desperate strangers. Skirmishes with local forces became common, and disease ran rampant through the malnourished crowds. Dysentery and typhoid were constant companions, cutting down thousands who had dreamed of seeing the Holy Land. They were dying not in glorious battle but from hunger and sickness in foreign fields. This dire situation fostered a toxic and tragic turn. As they moved through the Rhineland, some within this desperate mob redirected their righteous fury toward a target much closer to home, the Jewish communities living in cities like Mainz and Worms. Fueled by preachers who argued that fighting the enemies of Christ should begin with those who rejected him, bands of Crusaders launched horrific attacks. These pogroms were a grotesque perversion of the crusading ideal, a violent outburst of bigotry and greed that stained the movement from its very beginning. It was a dark chapter that revealed how easily spiritual fervor could curdle into blind hatred. By the time the ragged remnants of the People's Crusade straggled into the territory of the Byzantine Empire, their numbers were a fraction of what they had been. The Emperor Alexios Komnenos looked upon them not as the mighty army he had requested from the West, but as an undisciplined and troublesome rabble. He quickly ferried them across the Bosporus into Anatolia, where, utterly unprepared for the organized military power of the Seljuk Turks, they were almost completely annihilated in a single, devastating ambush. The great popular wave had broken against the shores of reality. This disastrous prelude served as a grim lesson for the professional armies that followed. The suffering on the road had forged the survivors into a different kind of force, one defined by desperation and a hardened resolve. They had learned that faith alone was not a shield against arrows or a cure for starvation. The stark contrast between their idealistic dreams and the brutal truth of the journey only deepened their determination, setting a somber and ruthless tone for the sieges and battles that lay ahead. The walls of Antioch rose like a mountain range, a seemingly impossible barrier of stone and iron. After the disastrous fervor of the People's Crusade, the professional army that arrived in October 1097 was a disciplined force, yet it now faced a trial that would push it to the brink of annihilation. The Siege of Antioch was not a swift battle but a grueling 8-month ordeal, a slow grinding down of body and spirit. The Crusaders built forts to blockade the city, but they were the ones trapped, caught between the impregnable walls and a countryside stripped bare of food. As the winter rains turned their camps to mud, starvation set in. Horses, the prized possessions of knights, were the first to be slaughtered for meat. Chroniclers wrote of men boiling and eating leather from their shields and saddles, a desperate measure to quiet the agony in their stomachs. Disease stalked the camps, and despair became a more dangerous enemy than the Turkish garrison within the city. In this cauldron of suffering, faith was tested not in grand sermons, but in the daily struggle to simply survive another day. It was in this atmosphere of extreme duress that a vision occurred. A poor Provençal priest named Peter Bartholomew claimed St. Andrew had appeared to him, revealing the location of a sacred object buried beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral. With hope nearly extinguished, the Crusader leaders authorized a dig. There, in the dark earth, they claimed to unearth a piece of iron, a spearhead. This was proclaimed to be the Holy Lance, the very weapon that had pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion. The effect on the army's morale was electric. The discovery was interpreted as an undeniable sign of divine favor, a promise that their suffering had a purpose and that God had not abandoned them. This spiritual resurgence gave them the strength to achieve the impossible. Shortly after, through a combination of cunning negotiation with a disaffected tower guard and a furious final assault, the Crusaders broke into the city and unleashed a terrible slaughter upon its inhabitants. Their triumph, however, was terrifyingly brief. Just days after capturing Antioch, the Crusaders found themselves trapped within its very walls. A massive Muslim relief army, led by the powerful ruler Kurbogha of Mosul, arrived and laid its own siege surrounding the city. The Crusaders were now the garrison, exhausted, starving, and caught in a trap of their own making. Their situation appeared utterly hopeless, yet fueled by the fervent belief in the Holy Lance and facing certain death if they remained, they made a desperate decision. On June 28, 1098, they marched out of the city gates to face Kurbogha's far larger force in open battle. Against all military logic, they charged. The Battle of Antioch was not won by superior tactics or numbers, but by a raw, fanatical conviction. The Crusaders believed they saw heavenly warriors riding to their aid, and this belief shattered the cohesion of the opposing army. Kurbogha's forces, expecting a weakened enemy, broke and fled. This victory against overwhelming odds was seen by every Crusader as a miracle, a direct intervention by God that confirmed the righteousness of their entire endeavor. The trial by fire at Antioch had forged them into something new. They were no longer just an army of pilgrims. They were now instruments of a divine will, hardened by suffering and convinced of their own invincibility. The long road to Jerusalem now lay open, and they would march toward it with a faith tempered into steel and a resolve that had been tested in the crucible of despair. After the miracle at Antioch, nothing could stand in their way. The road to Jerusalem was finally open, and the Crusaders marched south with a conviction forged in starvation and battle. They believed God himself was clearing a path for them, and in June 1099, after 3 years of unimaginable hardship, they saw it, the city of Jerusalem gleaming on the horizon. For these weary soldiers, this was not just a city of stone, it was the celestial city, the very object of their sacred vow. Yet its walls were high, its defenses were strong, and its Egyptian garrison was prepared for a fight. The initial assault was a bloody failure, repelled by boiling oil and a hail of arrows from the ramparts. Desperation began to creep back into the Crusader camps. Then, just as at Antioch, a reported vision stirred the army. A priest claimed the ghost of Adhemar, their beloved bishop who had died after Antioch, appeared and instructed them to fast and walk barefoot around the city walls in a show of penance. They did so, a solemn, barefoot procession that mocked their military failure and placed their fate entirely in divine hands. This act of humility, they believed, was the key that would unlock the city. On July 15, 1099, after constructing massive siege towers, the final assault began. One tower reached the northern wall, and after a day of ferocious fighting, a knight from Flanders was the first to surge onto the battlements. The gates were thrown open from within, and the army of God poured into the holy city. What followed was a storm of slaughter. The Crusaders, remembering their fallen comrades, driven by years of pent-up rage and a fanatical belief that every non-Christian in the city was an infidel defiling sacred ground, showed no mercy. They swept through the streets, killing everyone they encountered. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants alike were cut down, whether they were soldiers or civilians, men, women, or children. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres wrote with stark understatement that in the Temple of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees. A Jewish community that had taken refuge in a synagogue was burned alive within it. In the space of a single day, the streets of Jerusalem ran red, a horrifying massacre that Muslim chroniclers would record for generations as a defining act of barbarism. For the Crusaders, however, this was not a massacre, it was a purification. They saw the violence as a necessary cleansing of the city, a righteous judgment upon the unbelievers who had held the holy places captive. When the killing finally subsided, the warriors walked, drenched in blood and exhaustion, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. There they wept tears of overwhelming joy and relief. They had fulfilled their vow, they had taken Jerusalem, they believed they had completed the greatest pilgrimage in history and secured their place in heaven. In that triumphant moment, kneeling in the holiest church in Christendom, the horrific violence of the day was for them entirely justified. This conquest was immediately institutionalized. They established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Frankish-style feudal state with Godfrey of Bouillon elected as its first ruler, not as king, but as the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Other Crusader states were carved out across the coast, from the county of Edessa to the Principality of Antioch. On the surface, the crusade was a stunning success. They had achieved the seemingly impossible, but this victory planted the seeds of a profound and lasting problem. The new Kingdom of Jerusalem was a tiny Christian island in a vast Muslim sea. Its population, a small ruling class dependent on a constant trickle of new crusaders and pilgrims from the West for its survival. It was a colonial project born from a moment of extreme violence, and the memory of that July day would never be forgotten or forgiven by the surrounding Islamic world. It created a legacy of bitterness that would fuel a powerful counter-movement, a call for jihad that would soon find its own champions. The triumphant tears in the church and the blood in the streets were two sides of the same coin, a paradox of piety and brutality that would define the Crusader States for the next 200 years. But how much of what we think we know about this pivotal moment is actually built on myth? The bloodshed in Jerusalem created a powerful and enduring story, one that has often been simplified into a grand confrontation between two worlds. We often imagine the Crusades as a clear-cut clash of civilizations, a straightforward war between a unified Christian West and a monolithic Islamic East. This compelling but deeply flawed narrative obscures a much more complex truth. The political landscape of the Near East was not a chessboard with two opposing colors, but a fractured mosaic of competing ambitions where faith was just one factor among many. Alliances were startlingly fluid, frequently crossing religious boundaries with a pragmatism that defies our modern categories. The Byzantine Empire, a Christian power, repeatedly formed tactical partnerships with Muslim Turkish rulers against what they saw as the greater threat, the unpredictable and aggressive Crusader armies arriving from Western Europe. Similarly, the Crusader states themselves, desperate to survive in their hostile new environment, regularly signed peace treaties and formed military pacts with neighboring Muslim emirs. They would fight alongside these Muslim allies against other Muslim powers, or even against rival Crusader factions. The Islamic world was itself deeply divided. The Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo and the Sunni Seljuk Turks were not just rivals, they were often bitter enemies. For many of these Muslim rulers, the initial Crusader incursion was not seen as an existential holy war for the soul of Islam. They viewed these new Frankish invaders as another temporary player in a long-standing regional power struggle, a force to be managed, bargained with, or used against their local adversaries. This intricate web of shifting loyalties and cold political calculation makes the idea of a single, continuous holy war impossible to sustain. Dismantling this myth of a unified clash allows us to see the Crusades for what they were, a messy and protracted series of military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvers where the line between ally and enemy was constantly being redrawn. The image of the pious knight, his mind fixed only on heaven, is a powerful one, yet it fails to capture the full, complicated truth of the men who marched east. To see them as one-dimensional zealots is to miss the very human tapestry of ambition, desperation, and calculation that propelled them forward. While the promise of salvation was a brilliant flame, it was often fanned by more earthly winds. Consider the feudal knight, bound by a web of debts and legal disputes at home. Taking the cross offered a powerful legal protection, his person and property falling under the church's safeguard, effectively freezing his creditors and legal adversaries in their tracks. The crusade was a socially acceptable escape hatch, a way to leave troubles behind and potentially return as a hero, his past transgressions wiped clean by both God and man. For younger sons with no inheritance, the journey was a career move. In the newly established Crusader States, a brave and capable fighter could win something his older brother would never grant him back in France or Germany: a landed title, a castle, his own fiefdom. This dream of territorial gain was a powerful magnet, pulling thousands toward a future they could not build in the crowded landscapes of Europe. The material rewards were immediate and tangible. The sacking of a city like Jerusalem was not just a spiritual purge, it was a massive economic event. Plunder in the form of gold, silks, and jewels made men instantly wealthy. The shrewd Italian merchants from city-states like Genoa and Venice, who provided the essential naval transport, were never motivated by piety alone. They drove hard bargains, securing exclusive trading rights, entire city quarters, and tax exemptions in the coastal ports they helped capture. For them, the crusade was the opening of a new and immensely profitable market, a commercial empire built in the shadow of the cross. Even the grand spiritual incentive, the papal indulgence, functioned within a kind of economy. The remission of sins was the ultimate spiritual currency, a divine payment for earthly service that balanced the ledgers of both the soul and the state. To acknowledge this blend of motives is not to dismiss the sincerity of their faith, but to deepen it. It makes the Crusaders human, revealing how the hunger for salvation could coexist with the desire for land, the need for prestige, and the pursuit of wealth. This complex interplay of the sacred and the profane did not end when they took their vows. It profoundly shaped the way they fought their wars. The reality of combat was a far cry from the gleaming armor of later legends. This was warfare stripped of all glory, a visceral struggle for survival where the greatest enemies were often hunger and disease. Marching through the arid landscapes of the Levant, an army of thousands consumed everything in its path like a swarm of locusts. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin across hundreds of miles, and when food ran out, the horses died first. A knight without his warhorse was a soldier stripped of his mobility and status, forced to march on blistered feet like a common infantryman. Then the men began to starve. Chroniclers describe soldiers grinding animal bones for broth, fighting over rats, and digging for roots in the hard soil. Dysentery, the bloody flux, swept through cramped and filthy camps, weakening men until they could no longer stand. Typhoid fever, carried by contaminated water, burned through armies with a terrifying indifference. For every knight felled by a Turkish arrow, several more would succumb to the silent, agonizing death of sickness. The battlefield was not just a field of battle, it was the entire camp, a place where a simple cut could fester into a fatal infection and where a sip from the wrong stream could mean a torturous end. In this environment, the rules of chivalry, so celebrated in song, often shattered upon the hard reality of necessity. When a city like Marat al-Numan finally fell after a long siege, the starving Crusaders did not just plunder for gold. They committed acts of shocking brutality, driven by a desperate hunger and a deep-seated religious hatred. Reports, though debated by historians, tell of Crusaders resorting to cannibalism, a stark measure of their utter deprivation. More commonly, the sacking of a city became a frenzy of violence where the lines between soldier and civilian vanished entirely. Prisoners who could not be ransomed were often slaughtered, their lives deemed worthless. This was not an anomaly, it was a recurring feature of a conflict where the enemy was frequently dehumanized, labeled as an infidel whose very existence defiled the Holy Land. This constant exposure to death and suffering forged a unique and contradictory mindset. A man could weep in devout prayer at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre one day, and the next he could participate in the massacre of a captured city's population without apparent contradiction. In his own mind, these acts were not opposed. The violence was a form of purification, a grim duty performed in the service of God. The psychological toll of living in this state for years, even decades, is almost impossible for us to comprehend. It created soldiers who were both zealots and pragmatists, men for whom extreme piety and extreme violence were two sides of the same hardened coin, and the true cost of this relentless warfare extended far beyond the soldiers who wielded the swords. The civilian populations of the lands they crossed, Muslim, Jewish, and even Eastern Christian, paid the ultimate price. Their farms were stripped bare, their towns were burned, and their lives were extinguished in the crossfire of a holy war they never asked for. The Crusades were not a clean contest between armies, but a rolling catastrophe that consumed everything in its path. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a world of profound contradictions, a fragile European outpost grafted onto the ancient landscape of the Levant. Here, a tiny Frankish ruling class, perhaps no more than 120,000 people, governed a diverse population many times its size, comprised of Eastern Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Syriacs. This was not a simple occupation but a complex colonial experiment, a society built on a foundation of both coexistence and control. The Franks lived in fortified cities and sprawling castles, their laws and language imposed from above, creating a clear social hierarchy where political and military power was reserved almost exclusively for Latin Christians. Yet to survive, they had to adapt. They could not simply recreate France in the desert. They began to adopt local architectural styles, building homes with central courtyards for coolness. Their wardrobes incorporated light silks and turbans to combat the fierce sun, and their palates grew accustomed to spices, sugar, and citrus fruits unknown back in Europe. This cultural borrowing was a practical necessity, a quiet acknowledgement that they were now living in a land with its own deep and sophisticated traditions. From this environment emerged a new generation known as the Poulains, the children born to settlers in the East. These Poulains grew up speaking Arabic and French, understanding local customs, and often viewing their Muslim neighbors with a pragmatic familiarity that shocked newly arrived Crusaders from the West. They were the product of this hybrid world, often acting as diplomats and translators, bridging a gap that their parents could never fully cross. This led to periods of remarkable, if limited, tolerance. Trade flourished in bustling markets where Frankish, Armenian, and Muslim merchants haggled side by side. Some Muslim farmers and artisans continued to work their lands and practice their faith, paying taxes to their new Frankish lords in a system not so different from what had existed before. Yet this veneer of coexistence was paper-thin, constantly threatened by the underlying reality of systemic discrimination. The legal codes of the kingdom, like the Assizes of Jerusalem, were explicitly designed to privilege the Latin Christian minority. In a court of law, the testimony of a Muslim or a Jew carried less weight than that of a Frank. Intermarriage was officially discouraged, and social mobility for non-Franks was severely restricted. This was a society built on a fundamental paradox. It needed the native population to function and prosper, yet its very laws and identity were predicated on their subordination. This fragile existence was perpetually on a knife's edge. The Crusader States were like a chain of islands in a hostile sea, their survival dependent on a constant lifeline of manpower, money, and military reinforcement from the distant West. Internally, they were weakened by the same feudal rivalries that had plagued Europe, with powerful barons frequently challenging the authority of the King of Jerusalem, prioritizing their own domains over the collective defense of the kingdom. This chronic disunity and their precarious demographic position made them inherently vulnerable. The experiment was failing, and its continued survival would soon demand a new kind of defender, one bound not by feudal obligation but by a singular fanatical vow. Into this fractured and vulnerable world came a new kind of knight, one who took vows not to a feudal lord but to God himself. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller were revolutionary institutions, a fusion of the monastery and the barracks. These were men who swore the traditional monastic oaths of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet their daily work was not prayer and copying manuscripts, but training for war and patrolling the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. The Templars began humbly, a small band of knights tasked with a singular mission: to protect the stream of Christian pilgrims traveling from the coast to Jerusalem. The journey from Jaffa to the Holy City was perilous, with bandits and raiders lurking in the hills. The sight of a white mantle adorned with a red cross offered a tangible sense of security to these vulnerable travelers. But this protective role quickly expanded. the Templars transformed into an elite professional fighting force, the special forces of their day. Their discipline was legendary, their courage unquestioned, and their presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of a skirmish. Yet their influence extended far beyond the sword. They built a vast and sophisticated financial network that stretched across Europe and the Middle East. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar house in London and receive a letter of credit to be redeemed in Jerusalem, a system that protected them from highway robbery. This made the order incredibly wealthy, trusted bankers to kings and popes, and the managers of vast estates donated by pious nobles back in Europe. The Hospitallers, formerly known as the Knights of the Order of the Hospital of St. John, followed a parallel but distinct path. They never abandoned their original, merciful mission of caring for the sick and the poor. Their great hospital in Jerusalem was a marvel of its time, capable of housing thousands of patients, with separate wards for different ailments and a level of medical care unmatched in the West. Yet alongside this charity, they too became a formidable military order, their black mantles with a white cross becoming a common sight on the ramparts of the kingdom's greatest castles. Both orders answered directly to the Pope, placing them above the petty squabbles of local kings and barons. This independence, combined with their immense wealth and land holdings, made them powerful political players in the Levant, their support often crucial for any major military campaign. They were the permanent garrison, the institutionalization of the crusading spirit into a standing army that remained ever vigilant. Their very existence, these men who prayed with the devotion of monks and killed with the skill of warriors, represents the ultimate entanglement of faith and violence in the Crusader world. They were the backbone of the defense, a wall of faith and steel, but a wall, no matter how strong, can only hold for so long against a rising tide. The very success of the Crusader States sowed the seeds of their eventual downfall. For decades, Muslim resistance had been fragmented, but the persistent presence of a foreign Christian kingdom on the coast of the Levant slowly began to forge a new, unified identity. A powerful counter-movement began to stir, one that would find its voice in the call for jihad, a spiritual and military struggle for liberation. This was not an instant uprising, but a gradual awakening masterfully orchestrated by a series of brilliant leaders. First came Nur al-Din, a Turkish ruler from Aleppo who dedicated his life to uniting the squabbling Muslim emirates of Syria under a single banner of faith. He built schools and mosques, championed religious orthodoxy, and framed the fight against the Franks not as a simple border conflict, but as a sacred duty for all believers. His vision set the stage, but it was his Kurdish protege who would bring it to its breathtaking conclusion. That man was Saladin. Saladin was a political and military genius who understood that power flowed from both the sword and the sermon. Starting as a junior officer in the army of Nur al-Din, he maneuvered his way to becoming the ruler of Egypt, skillfully merging its vast wealth and manpower with the Syrian territories he later inherited or conquered. For the first time in living memory, the Crusader kingdoms were encircled by a single, powerful Muslim empire stretching from the Nile to the Tigris. Saladin's masterstroke was his relentless use of the ideology of jihad. He presented himself not merely as a king or a sultan, but as the mujahid, the holy warrior who would purify and liberate Jerusalem. This religious message was a brilliant political tool, allowing him to demand loyalty from rival Muslim factions and present a common cause that transcended old tribal and ethnic divisions. He was no longer just a Kurdish leader, he was the champion of Sunni Islam. His defining moment came in the summer of 1187. The Crusader kingdoms, weakened by internal feuds and a reckless military gamble, faced Saladin's unified army at the Battle of Hattin. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the Latin forces. The true cross, their most sacred relic, was captured, and the flower of their knighthood was destroyed or taken prisoner. With the main Crusader army annihilated, the road to Jerusalem lay open. In October of that year, the Holy City surrendered to Saladin. The contrast with its capture 88 years earlier could not have been more stark. Where the Crusaders had waded through blood, Saladin offered terms of surrender. He allowed for a peaceful transition, permitting Christians to ransom themselves and leave safely. There was no mass slaughter, no burning of synagogues or churches. His chronicler, Baha al-Din, meticulously recorded this mercy, crafting a legacy of chivalry and nobility that would echo through history, deliberately framing Saladin as the civilized counterpoint to the barbarity of the First Crusaders. This recapture of Jerusalem sent a seismic shock through Europe, shattering the illusion of a permanent Christian foothold in the Holy Land. The news triggered the Third Crusade, one of the most famous and star-studded expeditions in history. It was led by the titans of the medieval world, the fiery King Richard the Lionheart of England, the shrewd King Philip Augustus of France, and the aged German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Yet even this grand assembly of European power could not reclaim the prize. The crusade descended into a brutal war of attrition, marked by political infighting among its leaders and a strange, grudging respect between Richard and Saladin. The campaign ultimately stalled, resulting in a negotiated peace that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, but left the city firmly under Muslim control. Saladin's unified response had not only reclaimed the spiritual heart of Islam, it had proven strong enough to withstand the full, furious might of a renewed Europe. The age of Crusader conquest was over, replaced by an era of desperate rearguard actions and eventual collapse. The fall of Jerusalem was a bell that tolled across Europe, summoning its kings to war. This was not a call for common knights or fervent peasants, but for the crowned heads of Christendom themselves. The Third Crusade became the stage for legendary figures whose names would echo through history, a grand and tragic drama of clashing ambitions and unmatched military prowess. From Germany marched the aging Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a titan of a man leading one of the largest Crusader armies ever assembled. From France came the shrewd and calculating King Philip Augustus, a monarch more concerned with consolidating his own power than with distant glories. And from England sailed the fiery Richard the Lionheart, a warrior king whose personal courage and tactical genius would define the entire campaign. The hopes of Latin Christendom rode on their shoulders, a weight that would prove too heavy for their fractured alliance. The first blow fell not in battle but on a riverbank in Anatolia. The great Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, after a long and successful march through Byzantine territory, drowned in a shallow stream. His death was a catastrophe that felt like a divine judgment. His massive army, now leaderless and demoralized, simply disintegrated, its soldiers turning back for home or melting into the landscape. The German contingent, a crucial pillar of the crusade, vanished before a single major engagement had even begun. The remaining kings converged on the strategic port city of Acre, which was under siege by a beleaguered Crusader force. The Siege of Acre became a grueling two-year test of endurance, a muddy, disease-ridden stalemate that pitted the engineering skills of the West against the determined defense of Saladin's garrison. It was here that the political fissures between Richard and Philip became a chasm. Philip, a master of siegecraft, directed the construction of massive catapults and siege towers, but he grew increasingly resentful of Richard's flamboyant arrival and immediate dominance. Richard, for his part, seemed to embody the very spirit of chivalric combat, personally leading assaults and engaging in single combats outside the walls. The tension was more than a clash of egos, it was a fundamental divergence of purpose. Philip Augustus saw the crusade as a dangerous distraction from his real enemy back home, the growing power of the Plantagenet Empire that Richard would inherit. When Acre finally fell in July 1191, Philip seized the opportunity to depart, citing illness and the needs of his kingdom. His exit was a devastating blow to Christian unity, leaving Richard to fight on alone. Now the sole commander, Richard the Lionheart, unleashed a campaign of pure military brilliance. Marching his army south along the coast toward Jaffa, he was constantly harassed by Saladin's mounted archers. Richard imposed a discipline on his forces that was almost inhuman. He ordered his infantry to form a protective wall around the knights and baggage train, forbidding them to break ranks and charge, no matter how severe the provocation. For mile after scorching mile, the Crusaders marched in grim silence under a hail of arrows, their armor clinking like a slow-moving fortress. The Muslim army, expecting the hot-headed charges typical of Frankish knights, grew frustrated and disorganized. At the Battle of Arsuf, Saladin committed his entire force to a final, desperate assault. The Crusader line held, absorbing the shock until the perfect moment. Then, in a coordinated surge, Richard unleashed his armored knights. The charge was a hammer blow that shattered Saladin's army, a tactical masterpiece that secured the coast for Christendom. Yet for all his battlefield genius, Richard could not conquer the deeper problem. He led his army to within sight of Jerusalem not once, but twice. Each time, he made the agonizing decision to turn back. He knew that even if he could storm the holy city, he lacked the manpower to hold it against the forces Saladin could rally from the interior. His army would be besieged and destroyed, repeating the disaster of Hattin in reverse. The crusade had reached its logical, heartbreaking end. The war concluded not with a glorious victory, but with the Treaty of Ramla in 1192. It was a pragmatic agreement that allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city under firm Muslim control. Richard, the lion-hearted king, had to content himself with a strip of coastline and a fragile peace. His legendary rivalry with Saladin had evolved into a relationship of deep, mutual respect, marked by courtly gestures and exchanges of gifts, but it could not change the outcome. The Third Crusade was the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster that fails to capture the prize. It had everything: epic battles, legendary heroes, and a villain worthy of respect. Yet it achieved its central objective only in the hearts of poets, not on the maps of the Holy Land. This failure signaled a profound shift, proving that even the combined might of Europe's greatest kings was insufficient to reverse the new political reality Saladin's unification had created. The age of Crusader conquest was definitively over, replaced by an era of desperate diplomacy and a slow, inexorable retreat. The Fourth Crusade stands as a monument to a sacred ideal corrupted. In the year 1202, a grand army gathered in Venice, bound for Egypt with the blessing of Pope Innocent III. But this crusade would never reach the Holy Land. Instead, it was hijacked by a perfect storm of Venetian ambition and Crusader desperation, leading to one of the most shocking acts of self-mutilation in Christian history, the sack of Constantinople. The problem was simple and immediate. The Crusaders could not pay the Venetians for the vast fleet they had commissioned. The Venetian Doge, Enrico Dandolo, a man of immense political cunning despite his advanced age and blindness, saw an opportunity. He offered the stranded army a way to work off their debt by attacking the Christian port city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a rival of Venice. The Crusaders, trapped and penniless, agreed, even though Zara was a Catholic city and the Pope explicitly forbade it. This first diversion shattered the Crusade's moral compass. If they could sack one Christian city to pay a debt, what would stop them from sacking another? The answer lay in the tangled politics of the Byzantine Empire. A young prince named Alexios Angelos arrived with a tempting proposal. He promised the Crusaders immense wealth, soldiers for their cause, and the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches if they would help him reclaim the Byzantine throne from his usurping uncle. For the cash-strapped army, it was an offer they could not refuse. They sailed to the walls of Constantinople not as enemies but as liberators. They successfully installed their candidate as co-emperor, but when he failed to deliver the astronomical sums he had promised, the Crusaders' patience snapped. In April 1204, they turned their weapons on the city they had come to restore. The ensuing sack was a 3-day orgy of destruction that left even the perpetrators awestruck. They smashed ancient statues, melted down priceless works of art for their metal, and desecrated the holiest churches. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, drunken soldiers tore silk curtains from the altars and placed a prostitute on the patriarch's throne. They stole relics, vandalized tombs, and piled their plunder in mountains of gold, silver, and jewels. This was not a battle against infidels. It was the systematic looting of the largest and most cultured Christian city in the world. The Venetians carved out a commercial empire from the ruins, while the Crusaders established a so-called Latin empire that would limp on for half a century. The true cost, however, was spiritual and political. The schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, once a theological dispute, was now cemented with blood and sacrilege. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered its strength, leaving a power vacuum in the East that would later prove fatal when new enemies arose. How could a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem end in the destruction of Christianity's greatest city? The Fourth Crusade revealed that the machinery of crusading, once set in motion, could be aimed at any target, even itself. This corruption of purpose would soon take on other, even more disturbing forms. The Holy War had lost its way. By the 13th century, the cross was no longer carried solely toward Jerusalem. It was now raised against targets much closer to home, revealing a chilling new flexibility in the crusading ideal. In the sun-drenched lands of southern France, a different kind of enemy was identified, not Muslim but Christian. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, practiced a faith that the Church in Rome declared a dangerous heresy. In 1209, Pope Innocent III unleashed a crusade against them, offering the same full indulgence, the same forgiveness of sins, to any knight who would march not to the Holy Land but to Languedoc. This was a war of extermination waged against fellow Christians. When the Crusaders stormed the city of Béziers, they were faced with a terrible question: how to tell a faithful Catholic from a heretic. The papal legate's reported answer was brutal in its simplicity: kill them all, for God will know his own. The city was put to the sword, its population massacred. The Albigensian Crusade was a grim declaration that the machinery of holy war, with its spiritual rewards and papal blessings, could be turned inward, used to purify the faith and crush political dissent within Europe itself. At the very same time, on the frozen frontiers of northeastern Europe, another crusade was unfolding. The Northern Crusades targeted the pagan peoples of the Baltic region. German and Scandinavian knights, spurred by the same mix of religious zeal and territorial ambition, carved out new states in Livonia and Prussia. They built castles of stone in a land of wood, forcibly converting the local populations and forever altering the cultural and political map of the region. These campaigns demonstrated that the crusade was no longer a singular event aimed at a single holy city. It had become a versatile tool, a template for expansion and consolidation that could be applied anywhere the Church and its allies identified an enemy. What did it mean when a knight could earn his place in heaven by fighting fellow Christians in France or pagans in Lithuania, rather than Muslims in the Levant? It meant the original purpose was fading, diluted by 1,000 other ambitions. Even the traditional goal was not entirely abandoned, but its efforts grew increasingly desperate and tragic. The two Crusades, led by the devout King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, epitomized this fading dream. His first campaign ended in disaster in Egypt, where he was captured and ransomed after a crushing military defeat. His second ended with his own death from disease in Tunis, a continent away from Jerusalem. Louis was the ideal Crusader king, pious, courageous, and dedicated, yet his failures signaled that even the most virtuous of motives could no longer reverse the tide of history. The final symbolic blow fell in 1291. The great port city of Acre, the last major foothold of the Crusader States on the mainland, was besieged by the formidable Mamluk Sultanate. The defenders fought street by street, but the walls were breached. The Fall of Acre was a cataclysm. Those who could fled by ship, those who could not were killed or enslaved. With its fall, the 200-year project to maintain a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land came to a decisive and bloody end. The dream of Jerusalem, which had once set hundreds of thousands in motion, was now a memory. The crusading impulse did not die, but it had been transformed beyond recognition. It was no longer a pilgrimage to a distant shrine, but a weapon that could be aimed anywhere, its original focus blurred, its spiritual power harnessed for new and often darker purposes. The world had learned a terrible lesson, that a war declared in the name of God could be used to justify almost anything. That sacred fire, once aimed across the sea, was now turned inward to burn the house down. The war against the Cathars of southern France was a crusade in name only, a holy war perverted into a tool for doctrinal terror and royal expansion. Pope Innocent III, facing a heresy that challenged the very authority of the Church, made a fateful decision. He declared that fighting these fellow Christians was spiritually equivalent to liberating Jerusalem, offering the same full indulgence, the same guaranteed salvation, to any knight who would march into the lush lands of Languedoc. For the northern French barons, this was an irresistible summons, a chance to win both heaven and the rich estates of the prosperous south without the perilous journey to the Middle East. The spiritual and the material were once again entwined, but this time the enemy was not a foreign power, it was their neighbor. The brutality of this internal conflict shattered any pretense of chivalry. When the Crusader army arrived at the city of Béziers in July 1209, they demanded the city surrender its heretics. The citizens, both Catholic and Cathar, refused. What followed was a storm of violence that would become a dark legend. As the city walls were breached, the soldiers began to slaughter the inhabitants indiscriminately. It was then that the papal legate, Arnaud Amaury, was asked how the Crusaders could possibly tell the faithful from the heretic. His reported reply was chilling in its theological simplicity. "Kill them all, for God will know his own." The entire population of the city, thousands of men, women, and children, were put to the sword. The massacre at Béziers was not a battle, it was an extermination, a grim declaration that in this new kind of war there were no innocents, only the faithful and the condemned. This campaign of terror, which dragged on for decades, accomplished its grim objectives. The unique and vibrant culture of Occitania, with its troubadour poetry and relative religious tolerance, was systematically crushed. The power of the French monarchy expanded dramatically southward, consolidating its control over once independent territories. Most ominously, the Church perfected a new and terrifying institution to root out dissent, the Papal Inquisition, which would cast a long shadow over Europe for centuries. The Albigensian Crusade proved that the crusading ideal was no longer bound to a single holy city. It was a flexible weapon, a divine justification for violence that could be aimed at any target the powerful deemed a threat. This was the legacy of crusading reshaped, its fervor now available for rent, to be used not just for conquest abroad, but for purification at home. That legacy of violence did not fade with the Fall of Acre. Instead, it hardened into a deep and lasting scar across the relationship between two worlds, a narrative of conflict that would be carefully preserved and painfully revived for centuries to come. In the Muslim world, the memory of the Frankish invasions became a powerful and enduring symbol. Chroniclers and scholars meticulously recorded the sack of Jerusalem, the brutality of the Crusader Knights, and the long struggle for liberation led by heroes like Saladin and Baybars. These events, known collectively as the Frankish Wars, were not forgotten as a distant medieval chapter. They were woven into the historical consciousness as a stark lesson in Western aggression and religious violation. This memory lay dormant for a time, but it was perfectly preserved, ready to be awakened. When the armies of European colonialism arrived in the Middle East in the 18th and 19th centuries, the analogy was immediate and potent. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt was explicitly framed by his opponents as a new crusade. Later, as the British and French empires carved up the region after the First World War, local populations saw not modern imperialists, but the spiritual descendants of the Franks, returning once more to seize their lands and subjugate their faith. This historical parallel gave a powerful vocabulary to anti-colonial resistance, transforming a medieval memory into a modern political weapon. On the other side of this deepening divide, the West cultivated its own powerful self-perception. The Crusades had forged an identity of a unified Christendom standing as a bulwark against a foreign and threatening world. This idea of defending civilization against an alien other did not end when the last Crusader castle fell. It evolved, subtly shaping the mentality of the age of exploration and empire. The concept of a civilizing mission, the belief that European powers had a divine or cultural duty to reshape the world in their own image, carried echoes of that older crusading zeal. The language changed from liberating the Holy Sepulchre to spreading commerce and Christianity, but the underlying sense of righteous purpose, of a clash between a superior us and an inferior them, drew from a deep well of Crusader mythology. This historical baggage is not a relic. It is a living ghost that complicates our world today. Simplified, distorted versions of the Crusades are constantly retrieved from the arsenal of history and wielded by extremists on all sides. For modern jihadist propagandists, every Western soldier in the Middle East is a crusader, a direct continuation of the armies that marched under the cross. For xenophobic politicians in the West, the medieval conflict is invoked as evidence of an eternal and inevitable clash of civilizations, a reason to fear and reject an entire religion and its people. These weaponized histories poison intercultural dialogue and make mutual understanding exponentially more difficult. We are left grappling with a paradox. The Crusades were a complex series of events driven by 1,000 mixed motives, yet they have been flattened into a simple, powerful story of good versus evil, a story that both sides can tell about themselves. The true, tragic consequence is that this medieval shadow still falls across our modern world, influencing perceptions and policies in a chain of cause and effect that leads directly from the walls of Jerusalem to the headlines of our own time. Blood and trade flowed along the same roads, while the clash of swords between Crusader and Muslim armies defined the era. A quieter, more profound exchange was taking place in the ports, markets, and scholarly courts of the Levant. The constant movement of people and goods between Europe and the Middle East, however violent its origins, ripped open a curtain, revealing a world of sophistication that would fundamentally reshape the West. European knights and merchants, who had arrived believing in their own cultural superiority, found themselves living alongside a civilization that had preserved and advanced knowledge lost to them for centuries. In the great libraries of cities like Antioch and Damascus, they discovered the works of ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, along with groundbreaking Islamic commentaries. They encountered medical texts by scholars like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was a towering achievement that would become the standard textbook in European universities for hundreds of years. They learned of advanced mathematics, including algebra and the Arabic numerals that would replace the clumsy Roman system, making complex calculation possible. This was not a formal handover of knowledge, but a desperate, almost accidental absorption. A wounded knight might be treated by a Muslim physician using techniques far beyond any known in Europe. A Frankish merchant haggling in a bazaar would be exposed to astrolabes for navigation and new concepts of astronomy. This intellectual transfusion was the Crusades' most unexpected and enduring gift to the West, a treasure looted not from chests of gold, but from the pages of books, and it would become the essential fuel for the coming Renaissance. Alongside this river of knowledge flowed a new world of material goods. The Italian merchant republics, especially Venice and Genoa, established permanent trading colonies throughout the Crusader States, creating a stable bridgehead for commerce. Through these ports streamed luxuries that would transform European life. Silks and damask fabrics replaced coarse wool for the aristocracy. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and saffron revolutionized cooking, preserving food and creating a booming new market. Sugar, once a rare medicinal curiosity, was cultivated in the Holy Land on plantations worked by both locals and Crusaders, creating a taste that would soon drive a tragic Atlantic economy. Lemons, apricots, and spinach entered the European diet for the first time. This commercial revolution did more than just please palates. It built the foundations of modern capitalism, financing the rise of banking families and funding the artistic and architectural boom of the late Middle Ages. None of this was a peaceful cultural festival. This great transfer was born from the gritty, everyday reality of cohabitation in a war zone, a paradoxical mixture of hatred and dependency. Crusader lords collected taxes from their Muslim subjects, learned to appreciate their architecture, and signed treaties with them, even as they fought their coreligionists. The very ships that brought new knights to defend the faith would return to Italy laden with sugar, silk, and precious manuscripts. The connection between destruction and discovery was inextricable. The same violent energies that raised cities also opened pathways for knowledge and goods to travel west, proving that history's currents are never simple. The legacy of the Crusades is not found only on battlefields, but in the very fabric of our world, in the numbers we use, the foods we eat, and the ideas we take for granted, a permanent reminder that from the deepest conflicts, unexpected connections can grow. The romantic image of a knight in shining armor is itself a relic of a later age. Long after the last Crusader state fell, the memory of these wars was polished and repurposed, stripped of its gritty reality, and refashioned to serve new dreams. In the 19th century, as European nations built their global empires, they looked back and saw in the Crusades a noble precedent. Writers like Sir Walter Scott spun tales of chivalrous Crusaders and noble Saracens, creating a romanticized past that justified present ambitions. For the French, the Crusades were a story of national glory. For the British, a tale of adventurous empire builders. This was not history, but a potent myth, a vision of a time when the West heroically brought its civilization to a supposedly backward East. It provided a moral and historical alibi for the colonial projects that were then carving up the world. Simultaneously, in the Arab world, a different memory was being carefully unearthed. As the Ottoman Empire weakened and European influence grew, intellectuals and nationalists reached into their own history and found a champion, Saladin. The Kurdish Sultan who had reclaimed Jerusalem was resurrected as a pan-Islamic hero, a symbol of unity and resistance against the new Crusaders arriving by steamship and rifle. His legacy became a rallying cry, a proof that the West could be defeated, that a golden age of power and cultural confidence could be revived. This was not a simple act of remembrance, but a deliberate forging of a modern political identity from the raw material of the past. Today, this process of myth-making has accelerated into a dangerous shorthand. The word crusade is now a political grenade lobbed into modern ideological battles. For extremist propagandists, every Western soldier or policy is a crusader, a direct continuation of the armies of Richard the Lionheart. This framing collapses 1,000 years of complex history into a single, eternal war, a story of perpetual victimhood and religious conflict that serves to recruit and radicalize. On the other side, politicians and commentators sometimes invoke the Crusades as evidence of an inevitable clash of civilizations, using a distorted version of the past to stoke fear and justify suspicion of an entire religion and its people. In both cases, the messy, human reality of the Crusades, with its shifting alliances, mixed motives, and periods of coexistence, is erased. The actual medieval world is replaced by a cartoon, a simplistic narrative of good versus evil that both sides can use to paint themselves as the righteous defenders. This is why understanding how we remember the Crusades is just as critical as understanding what actually happened. The past is never truly dead. It is a weapon, a shield, and a story we tell ourselves about who we are. The echoes of those medieval wars are not in the ruins of castles, but in the headlines of our own time, a ghost that still walks the world, shaping conflicts and perceptions in ways the original Crusaders could never have imagined. The stones themselves tell a different story. Beneath the grand narratives of holy war, archaeologists are unearthing a more intimate history, one written in the foundations of castles, the fragments of pottery, and the very bones of those who lived and died in the Crusader States. These silent witnesses offer a perspective untouched by the bias of chroniclers, revealing a world defined as much by adaptation as by conflict. At a site like Kerak Castle in Jordan, the massive walls speak of a formidable European fortress, but a closer look reveals a subtle dialogue of cultures. The Franks who built these strongholds quickly learned from their environment, incorporating curved towers that were better at deflecting siege engine projectiles, a design innovation borrowed from their Muslim adversaries. They built vast underground cisterns to capture every precious drop of rainwater, a necessity in an arid land that their European homelands had not prepared them for. This was not a simple transplant of France onto foreign soil. It was a pragmatic fusion, a military architecture evolved for survival. Beyond the castle walls, the story continues in the soil of settlements and towns. Excavations in ports like Caesarea uncover layers of everyday life, a material culture of coexistence. In the same market-refuse piles, archaeologists find the distinctive glazed pottery of the Islamic world resting alongside the rougher, utilitarian wares of Europe. Coins minted by Crusader kings are found alongside Fatimid dinars and Byzantine solidi, all circulating in a single, interconnected economy. These small, broken objects are powerful testimony to a reality the chronicles often ignore. that trade and daily interaction between Frankish settlers and their Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian neighbors were a constant, unremarkable feature of life. How do we reconcile the image of relentless holy war with the evidence of shared marketplaces and borrowed architectural designs? The answer lies in the unavoidable pragmatism of a small ruling class living amidst a much larger population. They had to adapt to survive. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes not from what people built, but from their own remains. Bioarchaeology, the study of human skeletons, provides a grimly objective record of the violence of the era. Mass graves from the Siege of Ascalon reveal the horrific efficiency of medieval weaponry, with skeletons showing the devastating wounds from swords, axes, and arrows. Yet these same bones also tell quieter, more personal stories. Analysis of teeth and bones can trace a person's origin, revealing settlers who traveled from as far as England or Scandinavia to live and die in the Levant. They show the effects of childhood malnutrition and the wear of a life of hard labor. They also reveal the diseases that plagued these communities, from leprosy to the debilitating effects of years of poor nutrition. This physical evidence complicates the written record in profound ways. While the chronicles speak of two opposing worlds, the archaeology reveals a landscape of intermingling. It shows us a Frankish lord who fortified his castle with the latest Eastern military technology while dining from fine Islamic porcelain. It shows us a society where a Crusader's sword was paid for with a Muslim merchant's gold coin. The stones and bones do not deny the terrible conflict, but they insist that life, in all its stubborn complexity, carried on around it. This tangible past adds a crucial layer of nuance, forcing us to see the Crusader world not as a simple stage for clashing armies, but as a lived-in place where people built homes, raised families, and forged a new, hybrid existence in the shadow of war. The legacy of the Crusades is not written only in stone, but in the conscience of faith itself. These wars fought in the name of God forced both Christianity and Islam to confront a profound and painful question: how can faith be reconciled with the horrors of holy war? For centuries, the Crusades were celebrated in the West as a glorious chapter, but a modern theological reckoning has been slow and profound. Many Christian denominations have formally reflected on this violence. In the year 2000, Pope John Paul II made an unprecedented gesture, asking for divine forgiveness for the sins committed in the service of truth and for the use of violence in the name of faith. This was not a simple apology, but a deep, institutional act of repentance, an acknowledgement that the cross, a symbol of redemption, had been tragically misused as a banner for conquest and bloodshed. This reflection continues to challenge modern Christians to examine how religious zeal can be perverted, and how the Church itself must constantly guard against the temptation to use coercive power. Within the Islamic world, the Crusader invasions triggered a parallel and equally complex theological development. The classical doctrines of jihad, which encompass spiritual struggle, were rigorously debated and legally refined in the fiery context of resisting the Frankish armies. Scholars grappled with difficult ethical questions about the treatment of non-combatants, the rules of engagement, and the moral obligations of defending Muslim lands. These were not abstract discussions, they were urgent legal and spiritual responses to a clear and present danger. The figure of the Mujahid, the holy warrior, was elevated and defined in opposition to the crusading knight, creating a powerful counter-narrative of righteous defense. These medieval debates left a deep imprint on Islamic law and thought, and their echoes are still heard in modern discussions about conflict, resistance, and religious identity. The Crusades, therefore, did not just create a political memory for Muslims, they actively shaped core theological and legal traditions. This difficult history now forms a critical and often painful starting point for interfaith dialogue. How can communities build bridges of respect when the foundation is stained with centuries of bloodshed? Honest conversations between Christians and Muslims today frequently circle back to this medieval wound. They require a mutual courage to acknowledge the pain inflicted by ancestors, to listen to the other's historical narrative, and to consciously separate the faith itself from the violent acts committed in its name. The goal is not to erase the past, but to disarm it, to transform a history of conflict into a shared commitment against its repetition. This is the slow, patient work of reconciliation. It asks us to look directly at one of history's darkest chapters, not to assign blame, but to understand how easily faith can be weaponized and to choose a different path forward. The true test of faith may not be in how we fight our wars, but in how we make our peace. This long and winding story, woven from faith and steel, defies any simple verdict. The Crusades were not a single event but a multifaceted phenomenon, a perfect storm of genuine piety, raw ambition, and the complex chess game of medieval geopolitics. We have walked from the electrifying call at Clermont, through the starvation and miracles at Antioch, to the bloody triumph and eventual loss of Jerusalem. We have seen how myth often overshadows the messy reality of shifting alliances, and how the motives of a single crusader could blend the hunger for heaven with the desire for a new plot of land. The consequences of those 2 centuries of conflict did not end with the Fall of Acre. They have rippled across a full millennium, subtly shaping the architecture of international relations and the deep, often unspoken, cultural perceptions that divide East and West. This history offers us a stark and vital lesson: the profound danger of simplifying complex human conflicts into a simple story of good versus evil. It warns us how easily the messy tapestry of the past can be cut down to a crude banner for modern battles. The power of historical memory is not a dry academic concept. It is a living force that can fuel resentment or foster understanding, depending on how we choose to wield it. The great historian Stephen Runciman arrived at a poignant and sobering conclusion after a lifetime of study. He judged the Crusades to be, above all else, a long act of intolerance in the name of God, which is the sin against the Holy Ghost. This is a powerful indictment, one that asks us to reflect on the corruption of the sacred for the purposes of the profane. Let this entire exploration stand as a reminder, a call to approach our shared and often painful past with the tools of nuance and empathy, to seek understanding even when the history is difficult. I would love to hear your own reflections. What part of this long journey resonated most with you, or what questions remain? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into a history that still echoes around us. If you want to continue these journeys into the past, don't forget